Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marielle Lorenz, and I supervise the PAVE program at the Center for Advocacy for the Rights and Interests of the Elderly. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for this webinar. There are reflective questions throughout this presentation, so we encourage you to pause the recording, reflect, and come back when you're ready. And we encourage you to share this information with friends, colleagues, neighbors, family, and other older adults in your life who you think could best benefit. And talking about trauma in general can be a pretty heavy thing at times. So we certainly encourage you, if you need to take breaks, to take care of yourself, and come back when you're ready. I just want to share a quick background on how this presentation came to be. The intention was to have this as part of a symposium to commemorate National Crime Victims' Rights Week, which was at the end of April, and also recognize the 10th anniversary of the Philadelphia Financial Exploitation Task Force. With COVID-19, that forced us to change how to present this information to you, and here we are. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day was this past June, on June 15th. And with some very important events happening right now, this information is very much more needed to be heard. So with that, I'd like to introduce our main speaker, Katie Block. Katie Block is a project coordinator for the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, a project of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. In her role at NCALL, she provides nationwide leadership, technical assistance, and training to victim services professionals across the country on topics related to abuse in later life and elder justice. She coordinates NCALL's work on the Office for Victims of Crime's National Resource Center for Reaching Victims, a one-stop shop where professionals and policymakers may get information and expert guidance to enhance their capacity to identify, reach, and serve all victims. In her past work, Katie supervised a victim services program designed for older adults in Philadelphia, here at CARIE. Her focus was on ensuring equitable access to justice for older victims and developing program and collaborations to better reach victims. Prior to her work in victim services, Katie worked as a social issues marketing and communications consultant, providing marketing strategy, material development, and strategic planning support for her social service organizations. She received a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology from the University of Rhode Island and received a Master of Social Work and a Master of Public Health from Temple University. So thank you, Katie Block.
All right, thanks, Marielle. Okay, so today we're gonna, talk about older adults, trauma, and resilience. Thanks for the introduction, Marielle. So just to give a little brief overview of some of the work that I do at NCALL. So I really focus my work on supporting programs' capacity to increase access for victims who are in the margins. So that includes older adults, but it specifically includes older adults who are from communities of color, LGBTQ folks, folks with disabilities, anybody who has limited access to healing services and supports. So here at the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, we work at the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. We provide national technical assistance for all Office of Violence Against Women Abuse in Later Life grantees. We have a Office of Violence Against Women Resource Center, and we partner with OVC for the project that I work on, which is the National Resource Center for Reaching Victims. So generally, we provide training and educational materials, all related to issues around domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. So today, we're going to cover these things. We're going to do a general overview of trauma, a general overview of resilience. Throughout the presentation, as Marielle mentioned, you're going to have opportunities to reflect on how resilience shows up for you in your life and your work. And then we're going to go through some resources from NCALL, but also some local resources that Marielle mentioned. So just another reminder that talking about trauma can be re-traumatizing. So make sure that as you listen to this webinar and reflect on your own experiences, that you're taking care of yourself, rest or step away whenever it makes sense for you to do so. So why do we talk about trauma? So generally, we talk about it so that we can understand that it's a normal human response to violence. There is a lot of stereotyping and stigma around mental health, particularly in America, you know, in general mainstream American culture. There is this belief that sort of strength equates not showing emotion. People generally try very hard to make it look like they can, you know, quote unquote, keep it together. So by talking about trauma and understanding that it's a normal human response, it really, you know, humanizes the experience and just makes it so that we can sort of undo some of that stereotyping and stigma. The other thing is that talking about trauma helps shift from the what's wrong with them mentality to the what happened to them mindset. So once you understand that trauma reactions are normal reactions to not normal and unhealthy circumstances, then it provides some perspective to reactions to things like racism, oppression, mass violence. And it helps sort of shift if you're working with somebody who is behaving in a way and you can quickly go to, you know, what is wrong with this person? Like, why are they doing this? If you think at it from a trauma perspective, you can go to what happened to this person and are they having a trauma response? So it helps to gain some perspective and move more towards a collective healing. So how do we define trauma? I'm just going to read the definition so that everybody's on the same page about how we're talking about this. So trauma is the experience of an event or enduring condition in which the individual and or community experiences a threat to life, psychological well-being, or bodily integrity, and experiences intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So the thing to take away from this is that all people experience trauma in their own way. What may register as traumatic to one person may not actually register as traumatic to another. So the key thing here is that trauma is defined by the reaction, not the event, right? So for example, some people might actually view retirement as traumatic. It might incite intense feelings of fear and threat or threat to psychological well-being. Others might view retirement as not a burden at all. So the thing to remember is that it's all an individual experience and it's about the reaction to something, not the event itself. And generally, to the second bullet point, a traumatic experience often involves a person or a community's coping capacity to be overwhelmed. So this means that something can happen and just your ability to cope is sort of has an intense pressure put onto it. So again, that goes back to the fact that all people experience trauma in their own way. And it's about the reaction, not the actual event. So there are other types of trauma that are not listed on here, but when we talk about elder abuse and abuse in later life, these are at the forefront. So when we talk about relational trauma, that's trauma that's caused by a perpetrator, often someone who should be trustworthy. So when we, you know, many of us know the definition of elder abuse often includes violence or exploitation done by someone who's in a position of trust. So when we're talking about elder abuse, that's a relational type of trauma. Acute trauma is a one-time traumatic event. So that might be like a car crash or something like that. Chronic trauma is trauma that occurs repeatedly and over time. So again, we can go look at instances of domestic violence. Often domestic violence is a pattern. It can go last years, but it's a repeated occurrence. So that can be an example of chronic trauma. Then we can talk about intergenerational trauma. So that's the transmission of historical and ongoing trauma and negative experiences across generations. So an example of intergenerational trauma could also be the cycle of abuse. Oftentimes we can see that if someone experienced abuse from their parents, that they may perpetuate abuse to their children, and then that sort of cycle goes through generations. So this impacts the culture and coping mechanisms within families and communities. Next, we're going to talk about historical trauma. So this is the complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity and an affiliation or circumstance. So when we think about racism, the history of racism in America can be felt across generations. We think about the Holocaust, that can be felt, children of Holocaust survivors have trauma from the Holocaust, despite the fact that they didn't experience it themselves, but they experience sort of the collective trauma from their parents' lived experiences. And also, communities as a whole can experience trauma from the overall trauma that's happened throughout time. Next, we talk about complex trauma. So this is where there's a variety of trauma all at once, making an impact hard to assess or understand. So this occurs often. So we'll see that somebody who may have relational trauma, if they're a person of color, they may also be experiencing the trauma of racism. Or, when we're talking about elder abuse, specifically, we can see that folks often have polyvictimizations happening. So they might be being financially exploited while they also are experiencing physical or emotional abuse. So that's complex traumas, that multiple traumas are occurring all at once. And then when you're working with someone who's experiencing complex trauma, it does make it harder to sort of figure out where the root of each of the things are to help them sort of move through their healing process. And then the last piece that we'll talk about here is vicarious trauma, and that's when someone hears or witnesses someone else's traumatic experience. This is really important to think through if you're an advocate or somebody who works in aging or in mental health, that likely you are on a daily basis hearing other people's stories. So it's important to recognize that that in itself can be a traumatic experience, and that you should do the things to sort of make sure that you're moving through that process in a way that's healthy for you. So now we want to talk a little bit about how trauma shows up. So I would love for you to take a minute. You can pause the recording if you want and reflect on a traumatic event that you may have experienced. This does not need to be the worst thing that happened to you, but something that you can recall that put an increased pressure on your capacity to cope. So just take a minute and write down some of the feelings that occurred for you during the event. So, how did the trauma present itself emotionally for you? So some of the things that you may have wrote down could have included feelings of fear, inability to feel safe, feelings of sadness, grief, depression, anger, numbness is often present. There could be a loss of trust, a loss of self-esteem. You may have become emotionally distant. You might have experienced intense or extreme feelings. So maybe, sometimes you get a little sad, but all of a sudden now you're getting really, really sad. Or you might have muted feelings and then extreme feelings. So sort of going into polar opposites in shorter amounts of time. So the thing that is important to reiterate here, that there is no right or wrong reaction to a traumatic event, that all of these reactions are perfectly normal and are just an indication, again, that your capacity for coping is just being pushed to the limits after an event. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how trauma presents itself physically. So I'd love for you to do the same thing. Just take a minute to pause this recording and reflect on the physical sensations you experienced during that event. Again, this doesn't need to be the most traumatic thing you've ever experienced, something that you can just recall. And remember to take care of yourself while you're reflecting on your lived experiences here. So what were some of the physical sensations that you experienced during a traumatic event? So some of the physical reactions you may have written down could have included muscle tension. You might have felt jittery, nervous, have an upset stomach. Rapid heart rate is really, happens a lot. Dizziness, a sense of fatigue, feeling a little disconnected from your body. Compromise, your immune system might be compromised. So we see this a lot with older adults who've experienced a trauma, that they may have underlying medical issues, and then the experience of the trauma makes them even worse because their system sort of goes into hyperdrive. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the psychological and mental reactions to trauma. So after a person experiences a traumatic reaction, then it might change the way you think about the world and the people around you. You could be hyper aware of your surroundings. That's called hypervigilance. So you're just sort of always looking, always using a lot of emotional energy to sort of be aware of what's happening around you to give yourself a sense of safety. There could be a disconnection from yourself and from the world. That's called dissociation. Your attention may be impacted, so you could have poor attention. Memory problems may be present. You might have difficulty making decisions. Oftentimes we see folks will have nonlinear thinking. So what we will see with folks who are maybe going through the criminal justice process after they've experienced abuse, for example, and they're getting interviewed by the DA, and they can't actually put the story in a logical sequence because of a traumatic response. They're thinking of things out of order. This sometimes happens. It's very normal to happen, and then but what the struggle with it is that our systems aren't always trauma informed, so it makes like somebody who's providing testimony look like they're not giving a clear testimony, or that they might not be truthful if they can't actually lay out what happened to them from point A to point B. So that, that's something to think of if you're an advocate working with an older survivor. Another thing that can happen is nightmares or flashbacks. So generally what I was just mentioning is that often older adults face adversity, particularly from the criminal justice system. They might be stereotyped with having dementia, or again, they might just be stereotyped as not being good witnesses because they have this nonlinear thinking happening. So it's critical for advocates to be trauma informed. So understanding trauma can really help you support an older adult through their healing and access to justice. It provides a perspective on what types of support you can offer or help find to support them. And also it can help the advocate advocate for and with the older adult to police, the judges, the DA, and sort of undo some of the stigma and injustice that enters the equation often in these situations. And then we'll just briefly talk about behavioral reactions to trauma. So after somebody experiences a traumatic event, they might become withdrawn or isolated from others. They could be easily startled or avoidant. They might become confrontational or aggressive. They might change their eating habits or sleeping habits, and they might be restless. So all of these things, these behavioral things, this is what, going back to one of my earlier slides, is really important when you're thinking about shifting from the what's wrong with this person to the what happened to this person. So if you have somebody come into your office, or now in the time of COVID, you have a call with somebody and they're being really confrontational or aggressive, it's easy to just say, well, this person's just a difficult person. But if you take a step back and say, maybe they're having a traumatic response, and what happened here? Where are they in this process? And how can we sort of take a step back and look at it from that angle? So now that's the overview on trauma. So we'll do a little overview on resilience. So first I want you to take a moment and think about the word resilience, and just, pause the recording if you need to, and write down what first comes into your head. What do you think of when you hear the word resilience? So when we define resilience, resilience is the human capacity to bounce back, It's the adaptive human capacity to navigate and use culturally meaningful resources to sustain their well-being. Resilience is an innate human experience that everyone is capable of. It's not a trait that some people have. It's something that every person can learn, and it's highly individualized. So things that can impact resilience, help build it, are culture, your identity, your connection to supports, and problem-solving skills. So when we think about building resilience, there are several things that you can do. So I'm just going to go through this list and provide just some context here. So the first thing is that culture and identity matters when we're talking about resilience. Your culture can have a big impact on how you deal with and communicate feelings of adversity. Your identity and culture impact how you relate to significant others, to family members, community resources, and to the larger society. So some resources may not be available to you because of racism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, or you may have more access to supports than others do because of your identity. This all forms how your resilience is formed and shows up in the face of trauma. So think about what sources of strength and resilience come from what parts of your identity. So if you can think about who you are, you know, how you identify as a human in the context of your family and your community and the broader society, and what sources of strength come from those pieces. The next point I want to talk about is building connections. So good relationships with family, and that can be chosen families, friends, and others is extremely important when we're talking about resilience. Connection often includes being listened to and listening to others. It can help foster hope. Also, supporting others can help build your own resilience, and that all happens in the midst of having connected supports with family and community members. The next thing is building problem-solving skills. So you can't change the fact that a highly stressful event has happened, but you can change your response. So what can help you see beyond the present and look towards a future that may be and look a little better? So take a minute and think about what are some ways that you already use to feel better when you are dealing with a difficult situation, and can they be applied when you're dealing during or when you're dealing with an experience of trauma? The next point is that change is inevitable. So experiencing trauma may mean that certain goals are no longer attainable. The important piece here is that you want to focus on what you can control and not what you can't. So for advocates working with older survivors, it's important that you work with them from where they are and what resources and sources of strength they currently have. Helping to identify them, it can be critical to building resilience. So helping folks to identify what it is that they can control. This sometimes takes a bird's eye view, and so it's really helpful when advocates can come in and sort of do an assessment of what resources and strengths somebody has that they may not be seeing because they're in the midst of experiencing, you know, their own trauma. The next piece is movement towards goals. So the key here is that you want to focus on realistic goals. It can be really grounding to do that. So, you know, what can you accomplish today? What can you accomplish this week? This proved to be an important strategy with supporting older survivors during the COVID pandemic. You know, everybody's life obviously shifted. People had to stay in their homes. They were isolated. You know, they had to sort of reprioritize what their days looked like, which could be really, really challenging for a lot of people. So one of the things that happened with advocates across the country is that they took their, you know, safety planning skills and sort of applied it to sort of daily living. You know, how can you help an older survivor or just an older person, you know, think through like what's important today? What can I control today? What are the goals that will make sense for me this week? So action steps towards goals, they help to reinforce strengths and obviously then help to build resilience. So to that point, an emphasis on strengths is always going to be important in this process. So even during the hardest times, we all have strengths. You can work to identify what they are, where they exist within yourself, within your family, and within your community, and within the supports. So the most important things to remember here is that everyone has the capacity for resilience. It looks different for everyone. Older survivors can define what resilient looks like for themselves, and this might look different than how younger survivors define resilience. And then there's no end game, that it always is part of our living process, this sort of recognizing and building resilience. So healing does not look like you being who you would have been without the trauma you experienced. It's about folding in the wisdom gained from the experience into your life. This is often very painful, but it's also very important. So, thinking through all of those things, I'd love for you to just take a moment, pause this recording again, and reflect and write down, what ways do resilience show up for you? What pieces of your identity help inform your resilience, and how have they presented themselves in your life? How does your access to power or privilege or not having access to some of those things, how do those inform your capacity for resilience and how it shows up in your life? So take a moment to just write down some of those reflections. So now we're going to pass it back to Marielle, and she's going to talk through some of the local resources that you have access to.
Thanks, Katie. And I'm happy to sort of discuss and share local resources that are available to you and that older adults can access when experiencing trauma, and talk about each of these resources individually a little bit. So I'll first start with the Center for Advocacy for the Rights and Interests of the Elderly, CARIE, as we're known as. And so I supervise the PAVE program, and it's a program for older adults in Philadelphia or have experienced a crime in Philadelphia, that they're able to get in touch with us and we can connect them with victim services that could be available. So that could range from seeing if they are eligible for victim compensation assistance program. There's also assistance with ensuring that if individuals have to go to court, that we can provide accompaniment or ensure that they can actually get to court through transportation. I just think of it, it's a way that we can help individuals navigate the criminal justice system. It sort of can be a very intimidating and confusing system at times. So our role is really to help folks navigate that and be a resource to them. We also do have a counseling program as well. It's short-term counseling that's offered for individuals who have experienced a crime. And it's, again, just an ability for them to talk about trauma that a person has experienced, and then also learn about sort of some of the things that Katie talked about. How can resilience be built as well? And we also have a restorative justice program, which we partner with Good Shepherd Mediation. And this program is designed for those who want to address harm or crime through the restorative justice lens. We can advocate and help folks navigate through that process as well. And I also want to mention the CARIE line too, as part of CARIE, because that is a resource for individuals that if family, older adults themselves, neighbors, friends, whomever, and if they have had a concern about maybe an older adult experiencing elder abuse or trauma, then you can talk to advocates and we can sort of help you navigate sort of what the course of actions or what things that you can do to help that individual older adult in your life. So I just wanted to highlight those two programs at CARIE, and you can certainly learn more about CARIE through our website at www.carie.org. I also want to mention the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, also known as PSA. Their Older Adult Protective Services unit that is the unit in Philadelphia that would actually, if there's concerns or reports of elder abuse, they would be the individuals who would actually investigate that. So they investigate elder abuse, and their role is mainly just to ensure that if it is confirmed that there is some type of elder abuse going on, then that person who's experiencing that, they're safe. So some of the things that Katie talked about with maybe safety planning, those are things that PCA can, their investigators can engage in. We also have the Senior Law Center here in Philadelphia, and senior law helps individuals who are experiencing abuse, whether maybe financial exploitation or domestic violence. They have a program where they can, if an individual needs legal representation to file a PFA, or they need legal representation to address the financial exploitation, because it's such a degree now that they're unable to access their bank account. The issues can vary, but they're a very good legal advocacy resource to get in touch with that help individuals. And I also want to highlight here the Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline, and I should mention that Women Against Abuse, Lutheran Settlement House, they're all part of the Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline, but it's a hotline that individuals can contact if just wanting to talk to a trained counselor in regards to where to turn or what to do if they're experiencing domestic violence, or there is or if it's for a family member calling for someone else, what steps they can take when they feel ready that they want to address domestic violence. And I also want to mention the Anti-Violence Partnership in Philadelphia. They are a victim services agency. One of their programs is counselings for victims of crime they've experienced a pretty severe crime. And they have also some counseling available as well. So those are just some of the resources that are available in the Philadelphia area that older adults can access. And also for those who, like I said, loved ones, families, neighbors who have concerns can utilize these resources as well. And just to do what is possible to assist older adults.
All right, thanks, Marielle. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the National Resource Center for Reaching Victims. So this is a collaborative project that is funded by the Office of Victims of Crime. And the NRC is working to increase the number of victims who receive healing supports by understanding who is underrepresented and why some people access services while others don't. We do this, so NCALL is the lead partner for thinking through this issue related to older adults. So the way that the National Resource Center is designed is that they've identified different communities of focus, all of whom are marginalized when it comes to accessing victim services or justice supports or anything like that. So this includes communities of color, folks with disabilities, deaf and hard of hearing folks. Older adults are obviously included in there. Historically marginalized communities, people who have incarceration histories. So there's a whole host, and there are different organizations across the country who focus on each community. So again, we're the lead organization focusing on older adults here. So we really focus this work by designing and implementing best practices for connecting people to the services that they need, and really empowering and equipping organizations to provide the most useful and effective services for victims. So what this looks like is that you know, at NCALL, we'll provide general training around issues like this, or technical assistance, which just means that anybody could really call us, any organization can call us and say, you know, we're trying to think through how we can better serve older African Americans in our community. You know, can you help us sort of figure that out? You know, what are some ways, or generally just providing resources around elder abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault. The other thing that has come out of this project is that we've created a few tangible resources for the field. So one thing is a older victims of crime trainers and educators forum. So this is an online discussion board. It's hosted on the NCALL website, which you'll see on the next slide. But this is a place for anybody who's going out into the field, who's talking about aging issues, talking about older victimization, doing any kind of training or communication around it. It's a place for you to sort of come together and talk through strategy or tips or, you know, tricks or just different topics that can help sort of improve your capacity to do these trainings. So the way it's formatted is that there are lots of different categories that people can just have conversations in. It's like a regular online discussion forum. So the conversations people are having are about ageism, about the intersection of racism and ageism, different, you know, foundations for providing effective and equitable trainings. There's a place for statistics and also upcoming training. So it's a dynamic online forum that anybody can join, and I'll have information on how you can do that in the next slide. Another thing that we are working on that actually is going to be releasing this month is an older African Americans a guidebook created for increasing access to older African American survivors. So this has been sort of in development for the last year and a half. And what we did was we were able to interview older African American survivors as well as African American service providers in Milwaukee, and really talk to them about what their lived experience is like after experiencing a victimization, and what it looked like for them to engage with systems, to access supports, or be part of systems, or be a provider providing supports. And then we created a guidebook which really outlines sort of the history of racism throughout America, and how that impacts older survivors and how it currently impacts older African American survivors' capacity to access services. And then it also includes a workbook that has a lot of reflection questions, you know, based off of what's in the guide and off of what the recorded videos are of the interviews with all the folks we interviewed for this process. So it's a workbook where people can really spend some time with yourself to reflect on where your role is in all of this, where your organization's role is in all of this, and how can you sort of make the necessary shifts to move towards change that will look like increased access to older African Americans who are increasingly marginalized in terms of having equitable access to services. So those are just some projects that have come out of the NRC. You can access the forum now on the NCALL website, and the toolkit will be coming out this month. So here's the NCALL website. You can go visit it there. Also, if you ever have any general questions, you can send it to our general email that's listed here. You know, again, we're a abuse and later life resource center, so anybody can really send us a question, or you can, if you have questions specific to some of the things that I talked about related to marginalized communities, you can reach out to me directly. So here are some other ways that you can get connected with NCALL. So you can sign up for our quarterly e-newsletter. That's where we provide information about awareness campaigns, updates on all of our resources, and other information that just might be available. You can also sign up on there for an email listserv for abuse and later life advocates. The listserv provides an opportunity for advocates to connect, share information and resources. You know, I talked a little bit about the forum, so you can sign up at the forum here. And also, you know, we are always putting out tips and tricks and sort of, you know, other resources on all of our social media, so you can follow us there. And then here is my contact information, so you can feel free to contact me with any questions related to any of this.
Okay.
So thanks.
Katie, thank you so much for sharing this really important information with everyone. And thanks to all of you for viewing this webinar today. We have links below to the resources and organizations that you can access. And we would very much appreciate that if you did watch this webinar today, that we're linking to a survey below as well. So this is very important information that's utilized also. So we appreciate the time that you take to complete that survey. And just again, I would encourage you to share this webinar to the older adults in your life. And also, if you're interested in learning about some upcoming webinars or information that CARIE is putting out, you can always like and subscribe to CARIE's channel here on YouTube and be able to get notification of other webinars that we will post here in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And I hope you have a good day.